Hi, this is Deb Wenger. Today we're going to talk about movies. Chapter 8 titles the movie chapter Mass Producing Entertainment. So in terms of a mass medium, movies by and large are an entertainment medium. So I have a picture here of the Guardians of the Galaxy movie poster. Guardians of the Galaxy was a bit of a surprise winner in the box office wars for 2014. It was the highest grossing movie of 2014, and we're going to take a look at movie studio strategies that relates to how they make their money and how a blockbuster hit like Guardians of the Galaxy fits into those strategies. So early movie technology is interesting to me because so much of what we're talking about in this class this semester is how technology affects the media, the medium, the audience. So once again, our friend Thomas Edison shows up in this discussion. He is credited with opening the first kinetoscope parlor in the late 1800s. At that time, movies were very much a solitary experience, so you would just view whatever short film had been created. I think your text talks about images showing a horse in full gallop. And so movies didn't really have a storyline. They were just, gee whiz, look what we can do with moving pictures. Some of that changed when, I hope I'm saying this right, the Lumiere brothers invented the portable movie camera and projector, which made it much easier to capture more types of scenes, more types of motion and movement on film than ever before because they were mobile. They were able to go into a wider variety of situations and locations. In the early 1900s, Nickelodeon theaters became very popular. Nickelodeon theaters, of course, really changed the environment once again because it became a shared viewing experience. So it wasn't just you viewing a film on your own. You could be sitting next to family or friends and laughing together or being amazed together. Why called Nickelodeons? Because they cost 5 cents to see a movie back then. So film changes once again with a movie called The Great Train Robbery, directed by Edwin Porter, which came out in 1903. And let's just watch a little bit of it. I'm not going to have you sit through the whole 8 minutes here. But let me tell you what's going on. So the robbers are now on the train. They have killed the guy who was guarding all of the riches on board the train. They blow up the safe and pull out all of the cash and documents. Fast forward a little bit into the movie, and they're now robbing all the passengers. So lots of blood and guts and bullets and violence in this movie. Not too far off from what you might see in a movie today. So you notice there was no sound, no music. People were just mesmerized by seeing, quote unquote, action captured on film in a way they'd never seen before. Another thing that was unique about this film is that it had a variety of locations. We were outside the train, we were on the train, we were in the station master's office. There were 12 separate locations included in this film. Again, something new, and an actual story being told, which had not really happened before, and it established basic storytelling conventions. So from this point on, most popular movies actually had the beginning, middle, and end of a narrative that you might watch today. So back then, that movie, I think, was about a little less than 10 minutes long. And a new development took place in 1915 when The Birth of a Nation was produced. So this is a feature-length film, but this was a really long one. I believe it ran as long as 3 hours. And it focused on a very controversial subject. It was about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan following the Civil War. Produced by a guy by the name of D.W. Griffith, who's very important in film history. Some of you may be taking classes where you've talked about him or you've talked about this film. And he gets credited for kind of developing the system of a movie star. So he had a stable of actors who worked for him and appeared in multiple movies and really became well-known personalities to the movie-going public. It didn't take long for an entire studio system to develop. Under the studio system, stars would work for one studio alone. Let's say Paramount, for example, would essentially hire actors and have the exclusive right to that actor's film career. So if you were signed by Paramount, you couldn't go do a movie for MGM, let's say. In addition, they really exerted a lot of control over theaters. They would say, if you want to air this very popular Mary Pickford movie, you're going to have to take these other movies that may not bring in much profit to your theater, but they're not going to bring in any profit at all if we don't get them shown. So they would sort of coerce theaters into airing movies that they maybe would not have chosen to. And this whole idea of vertical integration then grew out of studios understanding that the more of the whole pipeline that they controlled from, having control over the actors, having control over the production, having control over the distribution, and many studios then purchased theaters of their own, and they really started to have too much control over what movies got made, how they were distributed, and who made money from them. So in 1948, the Supreme Court heard an antitrust case against the movie studios and Paramount in particular, and required that movie studios sell their theaters in an antitrust kind of decision. Another part of American movie history that I'm sure you've talked about in other classes before is the concept of the Blacklist. So the House on Un-American Activities Committee started hearings in 1947 trying to determine whether or not Hollywood was a hotbed of communism. So this plays off of what we talked about in previous chapters, the direct effects idea that somehow by watching a movie you would be influenced to think a certain way, and fears at that time that somehow if there were radical subversive themes showcased in movies that would convince theater goers, people watching those movies, to adopt those ideas. Famous group of people, the Hollywood 10, resisted testifying. They suffered for it. They were jailed and then blacklisted from the industry. And this went on for several years. By 1953, more than 300 people were blacklisted, including many prominent screenwriters. Fortunately, we've moved beyond that. However, for the movie industry, even a bigger impact had to be television. Prior to TV really taking off as a significant mass medium, movie tickets were sold at a rate of about 80 million per week in 1946, the peak of movies and their influence. By 1953, those ticket sales had dropped off to 46 million per week, so almost cut in half. How did studios and those producing movies react? Well, first round of 3D movies came onto the scene. Of course, that technology has improved a great deal since then. Larger format theaters were brought into play, so we got to see a more realistic view of a movie, better sound systems, so using technology to make that experience more exciting. Growing popularity of color. Prior to this time period, many movies were still made in black and white because it was a challenge to make a color movie. The equipment wasn't quite there yet, but they realized that was going to be a part of making movies more realistic and a much different experience than what people were seeing on television. And then the growth of multiplex theaters. So the idea that instead of banking on one movie, which may or may not be a hit, that you would release many different movies that would be seen in many different theaters, and that was good for both the theater and the studio, so that they didn't have to rely on, one movie that may or may not actually make it. The Blockbuster era was ushered in by JAWS in 1975. JAWS was released in the summer, which was also kind of a break with tradition. Prior to that, most of the big movies would come out around Christmas. That's when they thought most audiences would be available. And it sort of set off kind of a succession of big budget films that would be released really widely. Not just in a certain region of the country, but nationwide, internationally. In terms of blockbusters, Avatar is still the big winner when it comes to box office receipts. At the end of 2014, even though this was released in 2009, it was still the top grossing film. Interestingly, Gone with the Wind is still the movie that has sold the most tickets, but of course, much different ticket price back in that day. In 1990s, it became as important for your film to be released on home video as it was for it to be released into the theaters. You could make as much or more money from home video release. And of course, in the 2010s, where we are now, streaming has become a major factor for movies and how movies get viewed, and the financial sort of impact on the movie industry is something we're going to talk about in just a second. So what has happened to box office sales in recent years? You'll see in this graphic there was a real surge in movie-going in 2002, but as you can see since then, with the exception of a couple upticks here and there, that movie-going, actually going to the theater, buying a ticket, and watching a movie in a theater is on the decline. So what makes a movie profitable then? How can the movie industry stay in business? Well, your textbook talks about a couple of different ways. You can make a movie with a small budget and have a niche audience, let's say. You can then get a modest box office, so you don't have to make, $200 million. You can get by on $50 million if you haven't invested that much on the front end. So it gets a great return on investment. And examples might be High School Musical 3, which, High School Musical 2 were essentially made for TV movies. And then Disney realized, oh my gosh, these are incredibly popular. Let's put it out in the theater. It was a low-budget film by today's standards, but made a lot of money on the back end. Or you can go for that big budget film, hope that it reaches a wide audience. You want a big opening weekend. 50 Shades of Grey, for example, ended up having a much bigger opening weekend than even the studio thought it would. Also hope that it's going to play well internationally. And then marketing tie-ins. If you think about the movie Maleficent, for example, it seemed like every fast food meal in America had some kind of character from Guardians of the Galaxy or Maleficent. I think your textbook talks about the Harry Potter section of Universal Studios theme park in Orlando. So these are all the types of tie-ins that a movie production house, a movie studio might incorporate to try to make more money from the movie that it produces. So I talked about Netflix and the impact. A controversy could be playing out here in 2015 with the movie Hidden Dragon, Crouching Tiger, Green Legend. It is scheduled to be released on Netflix and in IMAX theaters only when it launches. Now that has theater groups upset. Some are saying they're not going to show the film at all. And part of it is they feel like that's going to steal the thunder. So they will not be able to make as much money as they used to. This should sound very reminiscent to what has been happening in the music industry. And it does sort of support one of our 7 truths about how much fear is generated by new technologies. So streaming has created a lot of angst and fear, and I would expect that it will become feel like even more of a threat to theaters and those who produce movies, because there's just not going to be the kind of box office sales that they might have had in years past. Now, from the standpoint of a movie lover, Netflix and other online-based distribution systems have been a boon for fans. On one hand, it makes a lot of small or kind of obscure films available to just about anybody. It used to be that there would be an art house theater in cities of significant sizes. When I lived in Tampa or when I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, there was one movie theater that would show the international films or would show documentaries. And now, of course, almost all of that content is available online. And it also has caused some movies that may have been produced years ago, like Ice Storm, to have a resurgence in popularity. So from the fan standpoint, certainly streaming has been a benefit. So part of what we're talking about, of course, is media literacy and the idea that mass media does have an effect and an impact on the people that consume it. And movies have long been sort of under the watchful eye of different groups. So in the 1920s, the movie industry itself created the Hays Code. They were trying to get around local censorship rules, so that it wasn't unusual for communities to have censorship boards that would try to say whether or not books should be available in the local schools, or movies should play at the local theater. And they have very strict rules on sex, profanity, and violence. And what's interesting to me is nearly 100 years later, that is what we are still basing our movie ratings on: sex, profanity, violence. 1968, the Motion Picture Association of America launched a movie rating system, and that has been in place since, although certain things have changed. You saw in your text we used to have an X rating. Now it's an NC-17. PG-13 came along somewhere between 1968 and 1990, but the current code, as you see listed here, G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17, has been in place since 1990. Now there's a lot of controversy about the rating system itself. I believe it's 12 people who live in the Los Angeles area that make up the ratings board that really determines what rating a movie gets. A lot of folks have criticized that system, saying that the mores and cultural values of someone in Oxford, Mississippi are going to be very different than a suburban housewife in LA. There's been a lot of criticism that the codes really penalize movies that have sex or profanity and let movies with, atrocious violence go with PG-13s or Rs. But if it has a little bit of sex, it's going to be an NC-17.